In this lesson, we're going to explore this discovery policy, which is actually very important. It's not very hard to do, but it's very important because that is where you specify kind of the minimum configurations that you would like for the chassis that you're going to connect to your fabric interconnects. We're also going to go over once again enabling server ports, because sometimes it makes sense to go over your discovery policy and then enable your server ports, and to make sure that everything gets discovered correctly. Finally, we're going to explore what's discovered. Let's take a look at UCS. Here I have UCS Manager. We're pretty familiar with the different tabs that are there, and the Equipment tab is where I go to take a look at my discovery policy, and it's where I can go to actually configure some of the ports on my fabric interconnect as well when we take a look at server ports. One of the tabs that's kind of way off to the side on the Equipment tab is when you highlight Equipment, it brings up this nice main topology view, but if you go all the way over to the right, you can see it's kind of off the page here, but there's a Policy tab. Now this Policy tab is pretty important. For instance, I can configure what the minimum requirement is for chassis to have as far as links between the fabric interconnect and the chassis. Now, if I don't want chassis in my UCS system with less than 2 links, I would configure 2 links here, and that way if somebody tried to cable the chassis up with 1 link, it wouldn't be discovered and I'd get an error. However, if I do say that my minimum is 1 link, I may have to go back later on and re-acknowledge my chassis if I'm actually using more than 1 link. This will allow the system to determine how many links are actually on that chassis and use those links to their full benefit. I can also choose my link grouping preference, which means basically, do I want to use a port channel between the chassis and the fabric interconnect? If you have this option, I would normally recommend it because it's the most fault tolerant. However, you can not use port channels in order to guarantee certain amounts of bandwidth to certain servers. Generally, the port channel is going to be your highest bandwidth and most highly available. Other items in the discovery policy that are pretty important are the power policy. How do I want my power configured? Do I want it configured as non-redundant, N+1, or complete redundancy, such as grid redundancy? I can also configure things like MAC address table aging, global power allocation policies such as power capping if I would like, and different user acknowledgement actions. But by far the most used 2 pieces in this policy are going to be the power policy and the chassis FEX discovery policy. Once I have that configured, I can go to my fabric interconnect, I can go down to my Ethernet ports, I can right-click on this port, and I can configure this as a server port. Once I configure it as a server port and the port comes up, it will try and discover chassis that are southbound to that port, according to my discovery policy. In this case, I actually already have a server port configured under port 1, and if I take a look at my port 1, I'll see that the port type is a server port. Based on that, this chassis was discovered. I have 1 chassis with 7 servers in it. Now normally after my first discovery, I'm going to want to go to my chassis and acknowledge the chassis. It's going to ask me if I'm sure that I want to do that, because it actually at that time builds the network connectivity between the fabric interconnects and the chassis. Once it's successfully acknowledged, it can go ahead and continue discovery and cataloging the servers that are inside the chassis. Please take some time to explore the Equipment tab. It's full of great information. For instance, I can physically see a graphic of my chassis, and I can drill down into the individual pieces and parts. If I want to double click on this server, it's going to go ahead and take me into that server. From that point, I can keep drilling down into that server and see what this server looks like. all the way down to what type of memory is in this server on the motherboard. So as you can see, the GUI is very powerful. Please take some time to take a look at it.